Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good evening, whatever time it is you're at. We are glad that you've taken the time to dive into another podcast with us. This is our 127th episode. Aaron Washington, your host. Glad to be back with you guys. Colin, our cap expert, joins us for another podcast. You know what time it is, guys. If Colin's on, you know we're about to deep dive into some numbers. So this is a perfect time. We have some deadlines that are coming up here as we get into December of the NBA season. I hope you guys have been enjoying it so far. Colin and I are definitely enjoying it, and we're looking forward to getting into some numbers here. We're getting into some trades that went down now that the deadline for several guys that signed in free agency this past summer have become eligible to be traded. There are some that are not eligible quite yet, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. Colin, before we get into that, man, I want to thank you again for jumping on. A little bit short notice here, but I saw an opening, man, to dive into some more numbers and get a little bit geeked out with the cap again. So wanted to bring you on. But excited for the episode, man. Thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, glad to be back on. And it's great to see the season's in full swing. And now we're going to get some interesting transactions kicking off. And we're already seeing some teams get creative now that with the CBA and the apron restrictions. So it'll be fun getting more and more nerdy as these transactions come through. Happy to talk about it.
Oh, yeah. You already know, man. So this is just the beginning. There's going to be more dates coming up as the season progresses. But for today, we're focused on trade season. This is not official, but I guess unofficially, most people would say that December 15th, which for us was just a couple of days ago, marks the official start of trade season in the NBA. Not that you can't trade before then, but there are so many players that are restricted before that date that it kind of makes things tough for teams that want to make a deal, especially in this climate now of the 2023 CBA and how things are being slowly implemented in to where teams are worried about the apron. So the more options that teams have, the better. And it makes it easier to work out a deal to where they're not up against aprons or activating certain hard caps and things like that. So now it makes more sense for a lot of teams to go out there and try to make trades here. So, Colin, we're going to get into the first deadline that is just approached here for trade eligibility, and that's going to be December 15th. So once we hit December 15th, free agents that sign with a team are eligible to be traded. Usually how that works is these players that sign in free agency can be traded for 3 months or until December 15th, whichever is later. So in most cases, that is December 15th. The restrictions are lifted. These players can be traded. So now we're looking at several guys that meet that criteria. A lot of them are a little bit of the lower caliber player. You're not going to see a ton of high-profile players here. There are a few, but just to go through some of the names that are now eligible, guys that signed in the summertime. The Warriors acquisitions, Kyle Anderson, Buddy Hield, D'Anthony Melton before he got traded. We'll get to that trade here in a minute. The Pistons acquisitions, Malik Beasley, Tobias Harris, Fontecchio. A lot of guys here. Thomas Bryant, who we're about to talk about here, just became eligible. He fits that criteria. Isaiah Hartenstein for the Thunder. The Magic acquisitions, KCP is eligible. Corey Joseph. It's funny here, Colin, because I'm looking at the Sixers section, and it's a lot of players. It's like half their team became trade eligible because of all the free agents that signed with them. Paul George, Andre Drummond, Eric Gordon, Reggie Jackson, Caleb Martin, Kelly Oubre. So, I mean, the list goes on. But all that to say, there are a lot of more players that are eligible here December 15th. Now, there are another batch of players that we still have another close to a month before they're eligible. These players re-signed with their previous teams, but they got a raise of at least 20% on their previous contracts. And teams used bird or early bird rights to sign them. So when you look at players like Nick Claxton, Miles Bridges, Patrick Williams with that 5-year contract, Haywood Highsmith with the Heat. And then you look at other guys like Malik Monk with the Kings, Emmanuel Quickley with the Raptors. Those guys fall under different criteria, so they're not going to be eligible until January 15th. So that's to set the stage here. I want to get those general facts out there just to let everybody know some of the players that fit December or January and exactly why they're not eligible until those dates. So, Colin, I want to give you a chance to throw in some more details if you have them about these dates. So what do you have as far as that goes, just in general of these like deadlines here?
Yeah, I mean, I think to keep it simple, I mean, any free agent signed this offseason, at least the earliest that they're going to be able to be signed is December 15th. And standard rule is any free agent, it's going to be the later of 3 months or December 15th. So most players are December 15th. That January 15th mark that you said, that's a team exercising full or early bird rights to sign over the cap and for more than 120% of the prior salary. One of the other rules that we'll get into, there's other limitations too. When there's a veteran extension for more than 4 years, they're limited to, or they're restricted from being traded for 6 months. There's designated veteran contracts; they're restricted from being traded for 1 year. So, but the majority of players are either up on December 15th, like we'll talk about a couple of those guys, and then the other ones are January 15th is the majority of the free agent signings this offseason. And then the only other limitation that I want to bring up, and we'll talk about for one of these players that got traded, is the implied no trade clause. And that's when there's a 1 year deal that's signed with the prior team who would receive full bird rights or early bird rights the next offseason. They get a implied no trade clause because essentially when they get traded, those bird rights don't transfer. So they receive an implied no trade clause. Now with the new CBA, you can waive that no trade clause at the time of signing, where prior to the new no trade clause or the new CBA, you had to waive it at the time of the trade. So now teams can go into it at the time of signing and have that waived. And we'll talk about that with one of our trades.
Perfect. Thanks for bringing that up, Colin. I was actually thinking about that as well. Teams can essentially veto a trade if they fall under that criteria of that 1 year. So, if there's a trade that, they don't want to, that for whatever reason, they don't want to waive it, then, hey, it's up to them if they want to stay with their team. So that's an important detail too that we should definitely consider here. We're looking at some of these players. So with trade season underway now, that opened the door for a lot of players to be traded. And even before that window opened officially, we got word of a couple of trades that went down. We're going to start with the Thomas Bryant trade here. This is a very straightforward trade. Essentially, Thomas Bryant goes from the Heat to the Pacers in exchange for the right to swap second round picks in 2031. So essentially for the Heat, what that does for them is, it's good that, I guess, first off, Colin, that they got some kind of return for Thomas Bryant. I wouldn't sit here and say he has any kind of legitimate value. In a lot of people's eyes, he's a negative asset with Miami Heat. Some nights he's a backup center. As other times he's a third string center. Hasn't had any real standout moments since he's been with the Heat. So, they got a swap, which is good, and it's a 2031 with the Pacers. So, there's no telling what that could be by then. But when they get to that year, the Heat will be able to, if they have a pick that is of lesser value than the Pacers, they can swap that and move up potentially several spots in the second round, which is definitely valuable. Also for the Heat, Colin, this gives them a little bit more power when it comes to their second rounders. They're pretty lacking in that department. I posted a tweet to our NTC account a little bit earlier, kind of describing this, so you guys can check that out if you want to get a screenshot of this. But essentially, the only other second rounder they have in their pocket right now is a 2026 Lakers second round pick. So, you look at their draft capital situation, that's all they have. 25, 27 through 30, they have no second rounders. And even the first rounders they have, some of them have some protections due to the Terry Rozier trade they made last season with the Charlotte Hornets. So definitely gives them something here. It's not an outright unprotected second, but something is better than nothing when it comes to Thomas Bryant, certainly. So pretty straightforward on that one. It was reported, I want to say like maybe Friday or Saturday, but it didn't go through until Sunday because of that trade restriction that was on Thomas Bryant. So, as a Heat supporter myself, Colin, I guess I like the deal. There's not much to it. But I see all the time people they were just so down on Thomas Bryant, and I was one of them. I wanted to see more minutes open up for Kel'el Ware, who, yes, he has some limitations, and he spent some time in the G League to get some minutes. I like that. But at some point, I would like to see Spo kind of give him a little bit more run, just to kind of let him make some mistakes and learn on the fly. So hopefully this trade does open up a path for more minutes for Kalel, where they still have Kevin Love. He plays a lot of five for them, a majority of his minutes at the five. So there's still some competition there, but for where it does give him the opportunity to get more minutes because one of their centers are out of the rotation. Any additional thoughts on the trade on your end, Colin?
Yeah, I mean, as far as just overall the point of the trade for the Heat, I mean, if you're not moving forward thinking he's going to be a part of any, even the back end rotation significantly, why not get something for him? So, I mean, it makes sense for the Heat. Certainly, it makes sense for the Pacers after their injuries, which we talked about last time. I just think that they need more front court depth, and it's slim pickings, and a lot of teams do. So for them to be able to just obtain Thomas Bryant and be able to have that, someone who can fill in some minutes is going to help them, for essentially, at least the Heat got something for him, and Indiana had to give up little to obtain him. So I think it works out for both sides. I can go through some of the cap mechanics here, and I do have this up on the cap notes section of our website too. This was the trade that I was talking about, where he was going to have an implied no trade clause because he signed a 1-year contract with Miami, but he waived that at the time of signing. So so there was no trade clause that he had to waive at the time of the trade. Like you said, he became eligible on December 15th to be traded. A couple things that are interesting about this, as we talked about last time, we talked about disabled player exceptions. The Pacers ended up getting 2 disabled player exceptions for James Wiseman and for Isaiah Jackson. Isaiah Jackson was $2.2 million roughly, and James Wiseman was $1.1 million. Neither of those had to be used because Thomas Bryant is a minimum player salaried, so they're able to absorb him under that straight exception. So they still have those disabled player exceptions. Now their roster is full. They don't have an open roster spot. And even though they have disabled player exceptions for those two players are still on the roster and they still are on the books. So it's tough to fill their roster spots and fit under they have just a little bit under the luxury tax right now. So it's going to be tough to be able to, again, they'd have to clear out a roster spot and make enough space to bring in someone else, absent a trade, of course, where they're sending out enough salary. But they could do that by sending out James Wiseman or Isaiah Jackson, similar to the Mountain trade, which we'll talk about in a minute. They could do that. They could also waive James Wiseman. They could also waive James Johnson. He's also non-guaranteed. Now there will be dead money on the books, but if they waived both of them, they would drop down, have an extra roster spot open, and then they could sign a player. They'd have dead money on the books, and they could sign someone for a little bit more money. But that's how they'd be able to do it. A couple of additional points to make. Miami is down to 13 players on their roster. That is only allowed for 2 consecutive weeks during the regular season and 28 consecutive days. So that tally is running right now for the Heat. They have to fill it within 2 weeks. And then if they drop back down, they only have 28 days total to do so. So they'll need to fill Thomas Bryant's spot moving forward, likely with another minimum guy to lower their tax hit unless a bigger trade comes along. As we know, Jimmy Butler they've been talking about him a lot. Finally, one other little piece of, cap mechanic quirk. There's a weird rule as far as when you acquire a player via a trade exception, he can't be traded for 2 months. Of course, there's an exception to that rule because there's an exception to every rule. And what that is if you acquire a player before December 17th, which is today's date as of us recording this, then you are able to trade him, aggregate him in another trade on the day before the trade deadline or the day of the trade deadline. So the fact that, one, he was eligible to be traded on December 15th, and then Indiana acquired him right away, that allows them to then take him and they can aggregate him in another outgoing deal either the day before the trade deadline or the day of the trade deadline if they see fit. So a lot of different rules for everybody, but even in the simplest of trades, we can find plenty of rules and plenty of exceptions to those rules to fire out there. And again, it's more easily laid out in my cap notes, in the cap notes section on the website.
Perfect plug, Colin. Everybody, for all of you that are listening, watching this podcast, I will leave a link to the cap notes in the description of this episode, so you guys can click on that and check out what Colin is talking about. It makes a lot more sense so you can see it up close. I know it's a lot, and it can be a lot to digest if you're just listening to it, but if you dive in on the website, it'll make a lot more sense, and you can kind of take a look at it and digest it at your own pace. So I'm sure that'll help you guys a lot with that. And yeah, on the Indiana side, I agree with you, Colin. I mean, they really needed to pick up another center. I know they went out and got Moses Brown and, gave that a shot. But getting Thomas Bryant, a veteran that's established, and, he's had some good moments in the past. I think specifically with the Lakers a couple of years ago, he had really solid minutes as a backup big. So, with Indiana, from what I've seen so far, he's been a good fit there, and he makes a lot of sense for them. He can throw up the occasional three, which kind of gives them a little bit of what they get from Miles Turner. And overall, it makes sense as a good move just to give them some more size and some more depth. That's something they really needed as a team that's kind of struggling. I think losing both of those guys really hampered them, especially Wiseman, because he just looked like such a natural fit there. And then Isaiah Jackson, I mean, he's had some great moments in the past just as energy big. So helps them recoup a little bit of what they lost from those two players. So definitely a good move on their part. So let's go ahead and look at the second trade that was recently went down. This one's a little bit more involved. There were some picks and players moved in this deal. So looking at the Dennis Schroder trade now, overall, the return for the Warriors is Dennis Schroder, in addition to a 2025 second round pick via the Heat. So that is a pick that the Heat originally owned that the Warriors will now own. On the Brooklyn side, they're getting Reese Beckman from Golden State. They're getting DeAnthony Melton from Golden State, who is out for the season with that injury. In addition to 3 second-round picks, it's going to be a 26 and 28 from Atlanta and a 2029 second-rounder from Golden State in the deal. So this is something else that I broke down over on our Twitter account at @NoTrade_clause. But essentially, the Nets now own 2 seconds in 2026, their own and that Atlanta second. And then looking at 2029, they now have 4 second-round picks in that year. So they have their own, they have a Memphis pick, they have a Dallas pick, and now they also have a Warriors pick. So a lot of selections here for the Nets. And on the Warriors side, they're kind of a similar situation to the Miami Heat. They don't have a lot of seconds, but now they do have that 2025 Miami second, in addition to their own in 2030, and then the least favorable between themselves and Minnesota in 2031. I also want to drop in a little bit of a note on that Miami pick. So the Miami pick is top 37 protected. So there is protections on this pick. Essentially, the Warriors will only get this pick. It will only convey from Miami if it falls between 38 and 59. So if it's in that range, it will go to the Warriors, and it will not convey to them if it is better than 38, if it's in the top 37. And then as far as their own second, the Warriors' second, 2030, that one goes to the Wizards if they do not convey their 2030 first round pick, which is top 20 protected. So it's one of those situations to where the first rounder, if it does not convey, it converts to a second. So I just wanted to put those two notes out there for anybody listening. But that's essentially the draft pick situation. The Nets are still kind of rebuilding their draft pick capital. They lost a lot in those blockbuster trades. When they acquired Kyrie Irving, when they acquired KD, when they acquired James Harden, it sapped them a lot of their resources. So by pulling these trades, getting off of Schroder, eventually you would think they would try to get off of Dorian Finney-Smith. And in addition to Cam Johnson, they'll also try to accumulate a little bit more capital there in addition to young players with some potential there. But they're doing everything they can just to kind of build that stockpile back up. This is kind of the windfall from all of those deals they made a few years ago. They're trying to kind of build a good base of young talent while also getting some good draft capital. So definitely good return on the Nets, getting those 3 second rounders. They did send out one, but you're getting some good draft capital there back in return. So I like that deal for Brooklyn for sure. And of course, on the Warriors side, Colin, I mean, for them, this is all about the Schroder acquisition. The picks are pretty relevant, I think, at this point. Curry is in the latter years of his career. Same for Draymond Green. They're clearly still in win now mode. That's still their goal here. So you acquire Schroder. And the big thing about this trade, Colin, is the fact that Schroder is another primary ball handler. You don't really get that from Brandon Podziemski. He is more of a kind of off the ball, gritty type of player. He's going to take charges. He's going to get rebounds. He's going to do the little things on the court. But when the Warriors put the ball in his hands and expect him to bail out the offense and run things consistently, that's not really his game. So you go and get Schroder, who's having a career year, honestly. If you look at Schroder's numbers, all very solid. He can set up others on the court. He can play some minutes next to Curry and those other guards there like Podziemski. He can go get you a bucket inside the arc at the rim. He's still super explosive, a great handle, and just another good veteran presence in that locker room. I don't really think that kind of gets them in that upper tier of the West. They still are lacking some pieces in my mind, but just from an aspect of trying to just pump in more talent in that organization, I think they accomplished that mission. So good on them for making that deal. And I think overall it's going to help them in terms of just generating more offense, both when Curry is on the court, playing with him, and off the court, but especially off the court, because there's something lacking there in the backcourt when Curry does sit for the Warriors. So what were your impressions, Colin, of this deal? I would love to hear them both, of course, from the cap perspective, but if you have any thoughts on court as well, definitely put those out there.
Yeah, as far as the on-court perspective, what I think is beneficial for Golden State is the fact that I think that he helps complement and adds depth to the team now, especially considering that DeAnthony Melton was obviously injured for the year, and they're trying to fill in some more minutes and figure out their rotation. The other thing that is interesting is moving forward, we're hearing them in on so many different trade conversations. And I think the big piece of that is, if one of these guys, Kuminga, Podziemski, any of these guys end up in one of these deals, then they really need more depth. And I think that Schroder kind of fits in both of those viewpoints. He fits in now to add, like you said, especially when Steph is off the court and those guys are off the court to assist in scoring, and he can kind of score on his own. But also, if a couple of those guys get traded and with Melton down, they really had nothing if they only bring back one, primary piece to play alongside Curry. What do they do at that point from the bench perspective? So I think that Golden State might be looking at it from kind of both sides there. So I think it works out well. They really didn't have to give up much to do this, a second round pick. And on top of that, they're able to get a body that can play and produce, unlike, DeAnthony Melton, who, like I said, even though you get a disabled player exception, he's still on your book. So as tight as they were to the first apron, which we'll talk about in a second, they had a guy on their team and pressing up against the first apron with his salary of $12.8 million that simply just wasn't playing, and that's not something that they can do right now. So they're able to flip him and a minimal pick for someone who can produce, and like you said, they're in win now mode with Curry and Draymond. So I think it makes sense for them. Just to break it down from the salary cap perspective, it's pretty straight up as far as the salary goes. Both of them were able to use the standard traded player exception because Melton plus the $250,000 cushion, although they would be able to use the expanded traded player exception if needed because they're below the first apron. And then Brooklyn, their outgoing salary is more, so it was easy enough. And then Beckman is $0 outgoing and incoming because he's a two-way player. A couple other points. The same rules applied to both Melton and Schroder as they did for Thomas Bryant. Both of them were trade eligible December 15th. Both of them cannot be aggregated in a new trade for 2 months. However, for that carve out, they can for the day before and the day of the trade deadline. So they can still be used in the future. I would imagine that Schroder could certainly be used. Melton, who knows? I doubt that Brooklyn would need him in an outgoing salary deal, but you never know. A couple of other points. Golden State added a couple $100,000, just the difference between Schroder and Melton's salary. So now they sit just over $330,000 below the first apron, where they're hard capped. So they're super tight to the first apron right now, which is going to make trades a little difficult. And then they do have an open roster spot. They're at 14. You can have 15, but they have no money. So they have to basically wait until if they sign someone, absent, of course, a trade, which can change anything. But if they want to sit and sign a free agent in the buyout market or whatnot, they essentially have to wait until March 18th to sign someone, because you apply a prorated salary and that would get them below that amount, and then they would be able to do so. They also have an open two-way roster spot, which, again, that's $0 salary. They can fill that at any time. And then on the Brooklyn side of things, again, they save an additional $200,000 in salary with the difference with Melton coming in. They're about $6 million, a little over $6 million below the first apron, and they're about $3 million below the tax, which I'm sure they're going to want to stay below, pending some incentives that I'm sure they don't expect to hit. They net 2 second-round picks in this, which is great. Schroder was playing great for them, which I'm sure isn't exactly what they want right now. So they send out Schroder, who is playing really well. They get value for him, which is great. And then what they do is they absorb a guy who's not going to play for them, but it's an expiring contract. They're basically the only team with significant cap space this offseason, which creates some really great leverage. And so they're able to add 2 draft picks and absorb just an expiring contract in exchange. So they're able to retain that cap space this offseason, which is great. It looks like they have $68 million committed this offseason, and that's only if Dorian Finney-Smith exercises his player option and there's no additional trades, obviously. So another big mouthful, but hopefully that breaks it down. Again, this is all written down in the cap notes if people want to check it out.
There you go, guys. You need to check this out because it is a lot, but if you take some time to read it and really digest it, it'll make a lot more sense. But yeah, Colin, I want to go back to the Brooklyn Nets here real quick because, I mean, yeah, their situation is very interesting. You move off for Schroder, and I brought up some of his numbers here just to kind of shed light on how well he's been playing. When it comes to the points per game, I mean, 18.4, 6.6 assists, which puts them, it ranks them pretty high up there in the NBA in terms of assists per game. 1.1 steals per game, so he's definitely being a pest on defense, which I'm sure the Warriors will also appreciate. He's attempting about 6.5 threes per game, and he's shooting about 38.7%. So he's got good volume, and he's got very solid percentage to go along with that. So Schroder's production definitely is way too strong for a team that's looking to draft in the top 5 in 25. And, you know, when you think about how strong this draft class is, they definitely want to give themselves the best chance at being at the top of the list there when June comes along. But now that he's out of the picture, I mean, they still have some more vets they can move. People talk about Dorian Finney-Smith all the time. They talk about Cameron Johnson all the time, who is also playing extremely well, especially when you look at his outside shot. But I don't hear a lot of people talk about Bojan Bogdanovic. He hasn't really been playing this season. He's kind of a forgotten name there. But that's another guy that's, you know, making pretty good money for Brooklyn at $19 million. So that's a name that's going to be coming off the books next season, along with Ben Simmons. So I mean, transition. Finally, man. I mean, geez, I know this team has been waiting what seems like forever for that max contract to come off the books. I mean, it's just insane when it comes to how much of a negative contract he is in the NBA, which kind of going back to Ben Simmons for a second, I think it's been reported that now that Schroeder's out of the picture, Brooklyn is going to be looking to play him at the point going forward rather than being at the 4 spot. So I'm interested to see how that affects his production. It looks like a lot of times when he's at the 4, he's just kind of in the dunker spot a lot. He's not really involved in the offense. So if he's more on ball, maybe that kind of brings out a little bit of what we saw in Philadelphia with his passing game, being able to start the break. I think he can lean into his strengths a little bit more, as opposed to just being an off-ball guy that just kind of stands around and just sets some screens. I don't really think that's who he is. So if he's able to kind of tap into what made him special in Philadelphia, hey, maybe we could see an uptick in production. Who knows about that? But the future, I think, is looking a lot better for Brooklyn. I think they're making a lot of good moves here. I mean, especially when you look at how much money they're going to have this next offseason, like you mentioned before. I mean, it's going to open up a lot of room for you if you have 40 million coming off the books for the next season, along with some other players like Bogdanovic's 19 million, D'Anthony Melton's 12.8 million. So I mean, they're going to have a lot of options here. And then when you add in the new players that'll be coming in next season in that 25 draft, I know they're crossing their fingers for flag. Sack for flag is on, and we'll see what kind of results come from that. But they are going to have a lot of options here, and now that they have some picks to go along with that in the future, it's really exciting to kind of look at where they're going. So, their future is going to be exciting, and I feel like for the Warriors, it's kind of the opposite. It's like what does the rest of the season look like for them? It's more about the short term. How does Schroder kind of incorporate his game to the Warriors? I mean, if he has any kind of production similar to Brooklyn, I mean, the Warriors' offense is going to be in a great place, and I think defensively too. I think he can be a positive guy, even though he's pretty small. He can give you some of what you got from Melton, maybe not quite the same level, but he does get a lot of steals. He has a really good wingspan. He's pretty quick, so I think he'll be able to make some things happen there as well. So just a couple of notes I want to kind of throw in there when it comes to these two teams. They're completely different places, but they were able to come together and make a deal happen that works for the both of them. So any additional notes, Colin, do you have about either of these deals or just general cap notes?
No, I mean, just as far as looking at the Nets, I think looking at Cam Johnson to see, I think he's just such a great player. And he's still young. I know that they're kind of starting all over again, but unless you're getting blown away by a deal, I don't know why you would want to get rid of him. I mean, he's on such a reasonable contract too, and that's going to look more and more reasonable the next couple of years. And then the other one that's so interesting, and it's too bad that he's out right now, is Cam Thomas. And they didn't come to an agreement on an extension, so it's just going to be really interesting to see if he ends up getting dealt on such a reasonable contract to help bolster another team, as they move towards the playoffs, or if he's going to play it out this year, if the Nets think that they can get something done in the offseason, or he's just going to, play it out and they're just going to lose him for nothing. That would be too bad for the Nets if that was the case.
Right. 100%, man. So, yeah, we'll have to see. I forgot all about Cam Thomas. He hasn't played in a couple of weeks here, but he's another very important part of that core. And I'd be willing to bet that they'll bring him back next season, whether it's a match on that contract and restricted free agency or, they just offer their own. I think he'll be around for the long haul. But, yeah, we hope that you guys have gained a little bit of insight into these deals, not just the overall facts of the deal, but give you some insight into exactly why these teams do it and why they do it when they do it. The timing is key. But with everything that Colin's been talking about with these deadlines and these dates that people become eligible and these short windows to make things happen, aggregation, things like that, it's very important that teams make these trades happen when they do. So we want to thank you guys again for joining another podcast. We'll be trying to bring more of these your way as the season continues. As we get into January, I mean, even more very important dates will be coming up. Those 10 days will be coming up pretty soon here. And plenty of other dates that will be very important when it comes to the way that teams kind of balance their roster throughout the season. So, Colin, thanks again, man. It's been another great conversation.
Absolutely.
Excited to talk more with you throughout the season as these things break down. But, yeah, let's look forward to an NBA Cup championship game tonight between the Thunder and the Bucks. I'm super excited about it.
Should be a good one.
100%, man. So if you guys are looking for the cap notes that Colin has dropped here and, cap sheets and draft capital, all these things we talked about, notradeclause.com is where you're going to want to go for that. Our tweets, some notes about the trades and things like that over on notrade_clause. And then Instagram, notradeClause, one word is where you can find us. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. And we hope to see you on the next installment of NTC. See you next time.